Back in Exodus chapter 31 today, and we're going to try to at least wrap up this chapter and move maybe into chapter 32. We'll be picking up verse 12 of Exodus chapter 31. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there is Sabbath. There is a Sabbath of complete rest until holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in the 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he rested or ceased from labor and was refreshed. When he finished speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. Okay, what do we think about that? Not much, I guess. Well, the punishment should get your attention when being killed and being thrown out of the church, cut off. Okay, it should. Any other thoughts? We sure live in an area where there's a lot of people who still observe Sabbath to some degree. School being closed, not working, and these things, and they're basically for conflict, but still something they're supposed to do. Okay. Well, as supposed to, they certainly do it. Um, and it is kind of integral to their belief system. Um, I wrote a bulletin article a while back about our neighbors in this area who implement some of the dietary, and I guess I don't remember exactly what I said, if I mentioned the Sabbath keeping or not in that. Um, but it's um, whatever restrictions we have on it, or our attempt to kind of recreate or re-undertake the Mosaic Law, of course, is imperfect. Whoever does it in America, I think, and one reason for that is it was imperfect back then, when you have the whole culture built towards it. And so, if it was imperfect then, well, it's really going to be imperfect now. Sherry and I, it's been several years ago now. We took an Alaskan cruise out of Seattle, and we were seated next to two Jewish couples from New York City, and they were observant Jewish. I don't know if I can't say beyond that. Reformed, Orthodox, I don't know, Hasidic, I don't know. They didn't have a distinctive hair, and I don't remember the yarmulkes being worn. But if you've gone on a cruise, you know the food's a big deal. That's if you don't have good food on a cruise ship, people won't not be coming back on the cruise ship. So this was very good food, and they were eating microwave dinners with plastic utensils because it's not just enough to not have pork on your plate. You don't want to eat it off a plate that's had pork on it and all of that. You don't. It's just totally uh, very very strict, and some people can look at it, and I've heard people make fun of it, and I don't think it's really something to mock. I think it's really to actually do it, to try to do it, is a tremendous commitment. It's a tremendous act of devotion. And even in a culture where the whole culture is pulling in that direction, it's difficult. So you can imagine what it's like in a culture that is not pulling in that direction, that's not trying to do it. It's much more difficult now to try to keep the various commandments, the ones that are particular to the law of Moses, try to keep them now. Um, we have, I think, conflated as Christians to some extent Sabbath and the Lord's Day. You know, there was a lot of growing up, a lot of people that didn't think you should do any work on Sunday. You couldn't be a good Christian if your job required you to work on Sunday. I heard that a lot growing up. I heard it from preachers, which I thought was ironic. You know, uh, and there's in a culture and a society that's more or less 24/7. It's very difficult. You know, when you don't work Sundays, you are forcing other people to work Sundays a lot of times. And if you don't think it's right to work on Sundays, you better not be going out to eat after church. And if you're trying to keep the Sabbath on Sunday, you better not be going home and cooking a meal after you get out of church. You can go home and get something out of the fridge, maybe. You might just need to have it sitting out, whatever. That's the whole challenge of it. If you're really going to try to keep these commandments and impose these things on others, is it nice to have communities that promote Sunday morning attendance at church? I think it is nice. I was in Chattanooga many years ago, and pretty much everything was closed until noon. So you could get up and go to church. The whole community could get up and go to church on Sunday morning, but by noon, everybody's getting out. We need to eat, so you need to be back at work by noon, basically. So it's, I think what the intent is, and then what it actually becomes is kind of an interesting thing. Sabbath, though, is about rest, and it's about honoring creation. It's about, this is what God did. He worked 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And this is a sign between me and you, the Jewish people, the Hebrew nation. The Lord's Day, and it's so called that in the Bible, but the Lord's Day is about honoring what God actually did on that day, that he raised Jesus up, that it was a work of the Lord. And while we're pretty used these days to a 5-day work week, and if we have a really good job, we work Monday to Friday and have Saturday and Sunday off, that's a relatively recent advancement in workers' rights. If you got one day off back in the day, you were doing really well. And if you're an agricultural worker in season, you probably did not get that one day off. So a lot of the early Christians were slaves. They didn't get Sunday off. They would go to the assembly when they were able to get away from their employment, wearing whatever it is they were wearing. They would take the Lord's Supper when they got there. That's why Paul talks about things like wait for each other. That's something when we talk about observing the Lord's Supper, all the rules and everything we try to do about the Lord's Supper, nobody talks about waiting for each other. If you know someone's running late, well, our tradition, we start on time. And if we get out at all, we're getting out early, not late. So you better be there. And if you're committed to God, that will be your priority. You'll leave as early as you need to get there on time. Paul tells them, wait for each other. It's our culture. Our culture, we do have a lot more autonomy over ourselves. We can do whatever we want to do, but it's a different mindset. And I think thinking of the Lord's Day as a Sabbath is, I wouldn't say worthless, but it's really is taking two things that don't inherently go together and putting them together because we kind of like what we think is going to be the result. But then sometimes when we do get the result, we don't like it. Usually because it means more work. If all the restaurants are closed, then you got to cook or you got to eat at home or whatever. And I would say that probably under at least the rabbinic traditions of the Mosaic Law, probably walking out of your house, opening the door to your car, getting into the car, driving, getting out of the car, walking into the building. I mean, you are really pushing the limits. You would have a much better chance of just walking because you're not opening the doors and all that stuff. I mean, I'm not trying to get people to not keep a Sabbath. I think it's not a bad time to take or a bad idea to take a day to really cease from your own agendas, not try to accomplish what you want to accomplish. I would also suggest that if you keep your Sabbath on Saturday or Sunday and spend it watching football, I mean, your blood pressure is probably going up and down while you're doing all that. And you're watching people, you're celebrating their work on a weekend. So this is very much a hallmark of the Jewish people under the covenant with Moses. And there's good things about the distinctiveness of this. And it challenges, there's reasons for it, practical implications, certainly, to give workers, give everyone a day where they're not physically breaking their backs doing their jobs. But it's more of a religious observation. It's designed to honor what God has done. And it shows confidence that God will continue to do what needs to be done. And it's not a covenant that he made with every other nation in the world. And I don't, it's like fasting to me. It's not a bad practice. There's a former football player for the Seahawks. He was a big boy, offensive lineman, probably weighed 350 pounds or more or whatever. I think he's down to about 200 right now. He's fasted. I haven't checked on it in a few days, maybe in a week or more. But his name's Russell Okung, I think, like that. He fasted for at least, I think, 30 days, maybe longer than that, nothing but water. And he was down to like 200 pounds. He lost like over 100 pounds or something like that. And, he's checking his blood sugar. He's doing all this other stuff that goes along with not something extreme like that. It's not a bad practice. He's doing it for some level of spiritual. I don't know what his belief system is, but there's some, spiritual component to this whole thing of taking your mind off of food, of your own nourishment, of your own needs. There's value in all of that. And I think maybe you could say we should be fasting because Jesus says when you fast, most of us fast, 2 or 3 hours at a time from breakfast to lunch and midnight snacks and all that stuff. So, but that's a good practice. It's absolutely not prescribed in our relationship with God through Jesus Christ. And we don't know really how well they kept it. It's a very severe penalty. But sometimes, and we've talked about this before, when you have penalties that are so very severe, it actually impedes the enforcement of the law. I mean, if you see your neighbor working on a Sabbath, but you basically like your neighbor, are you going to roll over on him? Or are you going to turn him in where he gets killed? Maybe, but I mean, that's that's one of the quandaries. I mean, when you make these penalties so very severe, you actually there's a lot of movements about Implementing the death penalty for offenses like child molestation. Well, a lot of child molestation occurs inside the home. Are you asking the child to accuse the father that might be executed because of what the child has to say? Would that maybe protect the father because the child doesn't want to see his father die or her father die? So these very severe penalties, I mean, it's not like I think they don't deserve it. That gymnastics doctor that molested all those young ladies in the United States gymnastics program was stabbed repeatedly in prison the other day. I mean, I don't know how prompt they came to his aid. I don't know how, if I was the ambulance driver, I don't know how fast I would drive to the hospital. I mean, it's just, it's hard to feel sorry for him. And his sentencing judge did not feel sorry. His sentencing judge was a woman and said, while she's sentencing him, I hope they do to you what you did to all these girls. Now, that doesn't sound very much like a good judge to me. You committed a bunch of horrible crimes, so I hope more horrible crimes are committed. Now, is it fair? Do we feel sorry for him? I mean, not really, but that's, I think, where we're not the judges, perhaps, and why this judge is a judge down here and not a judge up there. Our humanity kind of gets in the way of a lot of this stuff, and so by the time Jesus comes around, Sabbath had kind of gone through a lot of evolution, and they had made post-exile, after they had returned from the Babylonian captivity, it was evidently very strictly enforced. They were much more Torah obedient after Babylon than they were before Babylon. They were much more monotheistic. They were more distinctively Jewish in those years, a little over 500 years between the time they returned from exile and the arrival of Christ. At the same time, by the time Christ does come around, all of a sudden it's a very strong burden. In the world, even then, the world changed. It was very slow. It was incremental, but it did change. And you'd come under Greek influence, you'd come under Roman influence and occupation, and it gets harder and harder when you aren't autonomous, when you can't control what you do all the time. It gets harder and harder to obey a law that's different than the law of the land. And I think they did the best they could to some extent, but they also kind of chafed under it a little bit. Jesus' disciples, of course, we know they harvest grain, walking through it. They glean from a grain field and, rub it between their hands. I don't know if you ever plucked wheat, but, you can just rub it like that. I don't know if you want to do it to our wheat now because of the chemicals or whatever. I've done it. You could just eat the wheat. I didn't do it around here. I did it back in Arkansas, but they grow wheat in Arkansas too. I'm sure it's not as good as y'all's wheat here. I'm sure. It's our little Arkansas wheat, but you can do that, but that's work. And that doesn't seem like much effort. They're still walking, supposedly, I guess you would say a Sabbath day walk, whatever is permissible within the interpretations of a ban on working. They could still walk some.
And is that part of why it was so burdensome by the time Christ came along? Was there so many rabbinic codes added to, or clarifications, if you will, or determinations?
Well, there were a lot of debates, and it's kind of hard to tell. It's kind of, we see in the kind of the Muslim world now so many varieties, and it's not like one is more. Oh, I'm sure some are more extreme than others, but they're just different. And when you clash in your form of your faith, you believe this, comes with the controlling power believes something else, you can have real problems. But the basic ban, I mean, it's pretty. I mean, you're harvesting grain. You are actually picking the grain. That is harvesting. You are separating the wheat from the chaff. It's on a micro scale. At the same time, Taco Bell ain't open, is it? I mean, boy, that's got to be the least kosher establishment in the world, Taco Bell. But maybe McDonald's, I'm not sure. But anyway, they're doing that. They have a point. And again, the penalty is death. This is a violation of your sanctification as a Jew. This is a sign that you are a Jewish person, that God has called you to be a part of his people. And you're breaking it. And Jesus heals on the Sabbath. I mentioned this in the handout. John chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. Jesus heals on the Sabbath repeatedly, and he catches flack for healing. Like that's a work. But in John chapter 5, he doesn't just heal on the Sabbath. He doesn't just tell the lame man, arise, get up and walk. He tells them, rise, pick up your pallet, and walk carrying your pallet. Now that's work. That's like getting in your car. It's like opening the door to get in your car. I mean, it's.
Well, I think it was work for the guy to get in there.
Well, it's there's a lot of work involved, but in everything back then. That's people who want to live primitively now. I have no idea. I don't think what they're talking about. There's no microwave nachos in a primitive lifestyle, but that might be for the best. But there's a whole lot of work. Everything. If you want nachos, you're making the nacho chips, you're making the cheese, you're building a fire, the whole thing. But I think ultimately, if you try to condense everything Jesus said about Sabbath keeping, it accepts and understands that works of compassion and works of necessity are permissible. It gets to the point. If your child falls into a ditch, kids today still sometimes fall down well shafts, don't they? They had a lot of wells. Jews were well diggers. Your kid falls down in a well. Tread water for 3 or 4 more days or whatever until tomorrow, I guess. And I'll fish you out then. So, works of necessity, works of compassion were permitted on the Sabbath. And ultimately, even with what Moses says here, what this law says here, which is very clear that the Sabbath is holy. It is very holy. It's right up there with circumcision. It's right up there with, this is an identifying characteristic of who you are as a people. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And that seems kind of obvious to us as Christians, and yet a lot of Christians have, I think, very confused ideas about the Sabbath, and I think that's not just other groups. I think that's some of our folks. At least it was, when I was growing up. One summer, or maybe more than one summer, but at least one summer, I was a crew kid at McDonald's. My younger brother and I both worked at McDonald's, and they had us assigned to unloading the big truck that came in every week. We had to be there at 2 a.m. to do that. And you have to, don't want to get into all of that, but you got to move all the stock around. You always put the oldest out front, serve that first, and let the new stuff age a little while before you put it out. You're not getting the freshest any time you go there. But so you have to do, it's quite a bit of work. But Ronnie and I had it kind of down where we would be done, ready for breakfast and lunch, have set up, even though we hadn't started cooking lunch yet, we'd have it as set up as we could before the store even opened. Because we worked together and we worked fast, and it wasn't that it was, we were young, we could do stuff like that. I couldn't do it now, but I did it then. And we were good at it, working together like that, so they really wanted us to do it. And that was on Saturday night, Sunday morning. We never went to church. We had to, once you did that, you worked until, the lunch rush was over. So go in at 2 and get off at 1, something like that. Church gone, over. Sunday morning, you better believe we were there every Sunday night. We had Sunday night then. We didn't have services online. We didn't have anything like that available. I don't think that would have cut it with Mom. I think we still would have been there on Sunday night. Mom, we'll just watch it on. No, I'm not falling for that. So it's. I think, working on the Sabbath, working on Sunday, working on the Sabbath was, of course, a very serious issue. That doesn't mean you couldn't absolutely do it. And how they enforced it, I don't know. It's kind of unclear historically. But there were times, Jesus' interpretation is the final one we have, and that is, to use humanity and compassion and be in touch with reality, which they probably were all along. I mean, that's probably how it started out. They probably tried to keep it when they could, and if their ox fell in a ditch or their kid fell in a well or whatever happened, but then they go off into captivity, and the prophets condemn the way they keep Sabbath before they go off into captivity. So when they return from captivity, they really lock down on it. And then they make it something no one can hold up to.
Well, earlier when you were talking about the waiting for, there's so much in the Bible that there, I can't right off the top think of where there's not supposed to be some kind of balance, some kind of compassion involved. There are some things that are pretty black and white. You have to work pretty hard to do something with them, but the most of the stuff, like you were saying, and 11 o'clock, we got to start. Let's get this thing going. Because if we're wait 10 or 15 minutes, this preacher, he's still going to get his time in, and his quick it's going to be later.
And the Cowboys are on, so.
But what there needs to be a balance, because you need to have you have a group setting, and you need to have some kind of structure to it in some form, but at the same time, there needs to be some compassion.
It needs to really reflect the culture, and in a place where, I mean, we try to, I think, sometimes over facilitate visitors attending and getting a benefit. I hope they come. I'm certainly think we need to be welcoming of visitors. But if you have a distinct culture to your location, and you know who's coming. Even this morning, we're down our numbers some, but we know who's coming and who not. It was one kind of possibility, and he showed up, so we're glad for that. But for the most part, we knew so and so is not going to be here. So and so is not going to be here. There's no point in waiting for those people to show up when we know they're not going to be here. But at the same time, if we know they're working because they're slaves and they have no choice and they will be here when they can, and it's not just nobody else does anything, and that's kind of when Paul talks about the Lord's Supper, and it's critical of how the Corinthians observe it. It's not that they're having a meal because they would be there for a long time. It's that it became really a Roman type almost orgy of food and wine. And if you're going down that direction, we'll see that in the next chapter. If you go down, if you sit down to eat and drink, and if you drink too much and you don't have the right principles in place, you can rise up to play. And the play is not cornhole. It's not pinochle. It's not pitching horseshoes. It's something very different. So it's one of those things where you have to really look at the culture. A lot of congregations do not eat in the building because they don't think it's conducive to the overall worship service when you eat in the building afterwards, because people are thinking about, and I know this is true. I'm not trying to pick on the ladies, but it's usually ladies doing most of the cooking. You're worried if sister so and so came in and turned the oven up again and going to dry out my casserole or whatever, that kind of thing. You got your food on mind because you're serving a bunch of people. You're being Martha in a way. You're worried about many things, and we expect you to worry about those things. And if you say we're not eating in a building, all of a sudden that's not primarily the concern, but people are still thinking about where am I going to go eat after I get out of church? When Rick finally shuts up, when are we going to go eat? And we did in Issaquah, they didn't eat in the building, but they would have monthly gatherings at various homes. That doesn't really solve the problem. You got to think about, especially for us, we were coming from Covington to Issaquah and then going maybe, to Renton or someplace like that in Seattle traffic. What can I bring where there's no kitchen? I can't keep it cold or hot. It's got to sit in the car. And their service, they were very relaxed about when it started and how long it went. The preacher went 45 minutes at least every Sunday. And they came back on Sunday night. It was a very different worship experience. This is much more like what I grew up with. We start on time and we're out in an hour. But we also came Sunday morning, Bible class, Sunday night, Wednesday night.
And by having the Sunday night service, they were waiting on these people. It didn't matter that they started on time Sunday morning because they were waiting for them Sunday evening when they were able to do that.
If they could be there, yes. That's a form. That's a good point, Thelma. That's a form of waiting on each other. We now, but in our culture, we had a time where we couldn't gather at all in person. Everybody got used to taking the Lord's Supper at home. Most people have probably still leftover emblems. It's just, you have to make some decisions. It's not a bad thing at all to gather on Sunday evenings. But it's also, there was a cultural thing at the time. Some groups just go all day. They never get out. And that would just drive me crazy. I can't imagine spending 6 or 7 or 8 straight hours at church. Oh my goodness.
I love you guys.
I mean, the game is on, and I've got a recliner at home, so it's it's pretty tough. But I don't mind coming back. But it's anyway. That's an accommodation. That's a way of doing that, of waiting on each other. Now, I would say you could say the same thing about posting the service online. It's at your convenience, whenever it's available for you. Our communion service, and there are countless communion services by churches online. You don't like ours? We have a technical glitch and we can't post ours sometimes. Jay, you don't know how hard he's working sometimes to get the service recorded. And they saved us money with these cameras, and sometimes we pay for that they don't work. So he's recording it with his phone, and sometimes it just doesn't work at all. But he's trying. He's doing everything he can. And he's a very budget-friendly AV guy, I can tell you that. So he's doing his best. But even then, it's better now, but a couple of months ago, then it took hours to process the video and everything and make it where it could go upload, and then it's up to the companies. But there are any number of services already there that other Christian organizations, other Christian gatherings are doing, and you can watch those just as easily as you can watch ours. So, for communion purposes only, maybe that's the way of the covered wagon. I don't know, but I think that was very much a part of a form, an adaptation of waiting, because for early church Paul's emphasis is that when people come to take the Lord's Supper, there ought to be bread and wine there to take it with. And if it's gone, it shouldn't be because, Jethro went back for thirds, and now he's passed out in the corner of the tent or whatever. It's supposed to be everything done out of love. But when you put all these rules, and we'll see somewhat next week, I guess, uh, rule keeping just doesn't work. Even the most basic rule keeping is going to be fail because the humans will not follow it. You think these rules are simple? You think these rules are straightforward? I think there's 600 and something total laws of Moses, uh, commandments that make up the law of Moses. That sounds like a lot. We got a lot more than that now. How perfectly do we keep them? How many times do you driving down the road and remember, I haven't put my seatbelt on yet? Not Dolores. She puts it on as soon as she gets in there. Sometimes I do, and sometimes I don't. I remember the days when you'd be driving down the road, and if it looked like it was getting dicey, then you'd put your seatbelt on. It hollers at you. It knows you pretty well, huh? Need a reminder. Well, they do that too. So, but it's Sabbath keeping should, and any other commandment needs to be facilitating the worship of the Lord, facilitating our service of the Lord, facilitating bringing glory and honor and praise to the Lord. And sometimes the way we choose to keep or enforce these commandments gets in the way of bringing praise, honor, and glory to the Lord. I'll leave this, and I think I've used this before, but one of the big theoretical questions we would ask when I was growing up in the church was, if you're driving to church on a Sunday morning and somebody's got a flat tire, do you stop and help them? But knowing that if you do, you'll miss church, or at least be late. Oh, heavens forbid did you walk in 10 minutes late. Walking in 10 minutes late, no big deal around here, is it? But it was boy, you got talked to in the South growing up. You show up 10 minutes late, you better have dirty hands from changing somebody's tire. And that was like a question that we really asked and wrestled with. And it's like, why are we wrestling with this? Somebody needs your help. You're on the way. I can't help my brother, a fellow image bearer of God, because I got to go to church. Now, does that make any sense at all? It's not a discussion. Now, if you can't change a tire or whatever, that's all the little different intricacies of our human reality. If there was a single mom on the side of the road with a couple of kids with a broke down tire and I can change it, I need to change it. I wouldn't expect my friend in Port Townsend, who's 102 years old and can't see, I wouldn't expect her. She shouldn't even be driving. She drove too long and she doesn't drive now. But I wouldn't expect a really old, feeble woman to pull over and change a tire for somebody. She better get her bonnet to church. She can call. Most people have, and that's a scenario that's going the way of the covered wagon. Everybody's got a cell phone now. Everybody has AAA membership these days. I don't either, but most have. But you could, if they didn't, you could call Les Schwab and have them come and pay it for Les Schwab. So there's ways of. Are they not open on Sunday? Okay. Well, then just take them to Chick-fil-A then afterwards. So get them eliminated Chick-fil-A. No, that might not work either. It's the only time there's not a really long line there is on Sundays. So this Sabbath keeping, it seems sometimes kind of silly when we talk about the implications of it, but it's really serious. And if we take it too lightly, all of a sudden, there's no point in keeping the law. And that's the issue that Jesus keeps running into in dealing with the Jewish audience. The law is relevant. The law matters. The law establishes what right and wrong is. So keeping it obviously is important. But what happens when you can't keep it? What happens when you need to disregard it? The story of the Good Samaritan, the priest and the Levite are not supposed to touch dead people. He wasn't dead, but he could have died on them while they were carrying him somewhere. They were keeping the law. But and there is like the issue of human compassion. It comes down, as Jesus said, what are the two greatest commandments? And the two greatest commandments are not the 10 Commandments, any of the 10 Commandments. And they're not really expressly a part of the Mosaic Law per se. They are love the Lord your God with everything you are, and love your neighbor as yourself, which means really kind of as a family member. What would you do for your family? What would you do for your son that was broken down on the side of the road? Well, that's your neighbor. You're supposed to love him like you love your son. Might be get mad at him for driving around on bald tires. What are you doing driving around on bald tires, Rick? What do you think is going to happen? You really shouldn't drive on bald tires, but that's a different matter. So this is all, it's the law is difficult to keep. Without the law, there is chaos, though. They are in the abyss. We'll see that next week. Without the law, there is really no order. There is nothing but chaos. Trying to keep the law perfectly is a fool's errand. It will not happen. And our relationship with God cannot be built only on our obedience. Because if it requires perfect obedience by us, it won't work. Just like all this COVID stuff we had. We had all those regulations. And I think people by and large, tried very hard to respect the laws, to respect the new rules, and did a really good job. And you'd still hear people griping about, he walked down the wrong way down the aisle at the grocery store, that kind of thing. You're only supposed to go one way, and he came back at me while I was walking down that way. I'm going to die now. Well, maybe you will. I don't know. Maybe you'll catch COVID from it. I don't know. You couldn't dismiss that completely. But if your plan requires perfect compliance by everybody, you don't have a plan because you're not getting that. You're not going to get perfect compliance probably from anybody. And you're sure not getting it from everybody. And God finds out you can sometimes get perfect disobedience from pretty much everybody. So we'll look at that next week. Thank you for your attention and your comments. Mr. Kelso, will you lead us in a closing prayer, please, sir?